Hi, my name is Erica, and today I'm going to be reading The Elves and the Shoemaker. Once upon a time, there lived a shoemaker. And while he was an honest and hard-working man, the poor shoemaker never seemed to make very much money. One night, when the shoemaker sat down to work, he discovered that he had just enough leather to make one last pair of shoes. The shoemaker was tired after working in the shop all day. And so he cut the last of his leather into pieces he'd need to make a pair of shoes, but left the rest of the work for the morning. The shoemaker went to bed with his wife, sleeping peacefully beside him. He knew that he would have to rise early to make the shoes in the morning, but he would not let his worries stop him from getting a good night's rest. The next morning, the shoemaker awoke, well-rested and ready to work. But upon entering his workshop, he discovered that where there had once only been pieces of leather, there was now a pair of shoes. The shoemaker had worked for many years making shoes, and so he knew how to make a good pair. "The stitching is strong and the shoe is sturdy. Why, these shoes are perfect," said the shoemaker to his wife. Soon after, a man came to the shop. As he had only the one pair of shoes for sale, the shoemaker handed the man the mysterious pair. "What excellent shoes! These fit better than any shoes I've ever owned," exclaimed the man. The man was so delighted by the shoes that he insisted on paying the shoemaker double the amount. The shoemaker took the money from the sale of the mysterious shoes and bought enough leather for 2 more pairs of shoes, as well as dinner for himself and his wife. They hadn't eaten so well in a long time. Later that night, he did just as he had the previous evening. He cut up the leather into pieces and left them in his workshop unfinished. The next morning, the shoemaker crept downstairs and peered in his workshop, curious to see what he would find. "Come look, 2 more pairs of shoes," he said excitedly. "And they're just as perfect as the last pair," said his wife. And again, the shoemaker and his wife had no trouble selling the shoes that had appeared overnight. For not long after they opened the shop, 2 men arrived. They were traveling musicians in need of sturdy shoes for their travels. The 2 new pairs fit them perfectly. "We'll pay top dollar for such fine quality shoes," said one of the musicians. Once more, the shoemaker went out and bought leather, and this time he had enough money for quite a lot. As he had done before, he cut up the leather into pieces for many pairs of shoes and carefully laid them out before going to bed. Sure enough, the next morning the shoemaker awoke to discover a pile of shoes in his workshop, and each pair was just as lovely and as well made as the next. The traveling musicians who had bought the shoes the day before had spread the word about the shoemaker's shop. There was a line of people at the door, and all the shoemaker's shoes were sold the very next day. Over time, the shoemaker grew to be a wealthy man. Every night, he would lay up pieces of leather, and the following morning he would find all his work done for him. And every day, the shoes sold quickly. After many days of this, it was soon Christmas. "We must be thankful for all of our good fortune," said the shoemaker's wife. "For some time I have wondered who has been making the shoes who have made us rich," confessed the shoemaker. And so the shoemaker and his wife decided to stay up to see who would come. Together, they hid in a closet by the workshop. They waited and waited, and then, just as the grandfather clock struck midnight, they heard a strange rustling sound coming from inside the clock. As the bells of the clock began to chime midnight, the front of the clock swung open, and out jumped 2 tiny elves, barefoot and wearing old rags. They stretched and then ran across the floor to the table where the shoemaker had left out leather as always. The elves were a sight to behold. They worked side by side, moving quickly and nimbly, stitching the shoes together with their tiny hands. They worked all night until they had made an impressive pile of shoes. And just before sunrise, the elves hopped down and ran back inside the clock. "Those little elves have made us rich," cried the shoemaker's wife the next morning, "and they only have rags and no shoes. We must thank them for all the work they have done." "Certainly," agreed the shoemaker. "You can make them some fine clothing, and I shall make them each a pair of shoes of their very own." The shoemaker and his wife closed their shop that day, and instead worked hard on their tasks. All day, the shoemaker's wife sewed and sewed, while the shoemaker made 2 tiny pairs of shoes. That night, instead of laying out the leather pieces as they usually did, the shoemaker laid out the gifts for the elves. Then he went to bed, pleased with the work they had done. The grandfather clock in the workshop went tick-tock as midnight approached. As they had done so many times before, the elves popped out of the grandfather clock at the stroke of midnight. The elves yawned and went about their work as usual. But this time, the table was laid with clothing and shoes instead of leather pieces. The clothing was beautiful, and the shoes were just as well made as the pairs the elves had made themselves. The elves changed into the clothing and shoes, and were delighted to discover that it all fit perfectly. They began to laugh and do a happy little jig. They danced and sang merrily until they danced right out the door and away over the snow. From that day forward, the shoemaker and his wife never saw the elves again. But thanks to the elves, their shop was successful, and they lived happily together for the rest of their days. The end. Thank you for watching this video, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel.